Michael Burry anticipated that increased local output, the post-pandemic restructuring of global supply networks, and a persistent labor shortage would lead to greater long-term inflation in the US and worldwide. Burry's theory appears to be that US businesses, when faced with the greater costs of local manufacturing compared to outsourcing, will eventually work through their excessive inventories and pursue more aggressive price increases, which will ultimately lead to higher inflation. So let's ask this question. Could the closure of food production or packaging businesses, for whatever reason, result in a severe scarcity of food available for purchase in your neighborhood supermarket? It doesn't seem as ridiculous to imagine that businesses can shut down even on a global scale in light of recent events. More people seem to be concerned about rapidly rising food prices. We cannot just shrug off this act as though it is not occurring or possible. Not only is it feasible, but it's really occurring right now. So if you want to know more about the reasons behind the expected food shortage and how to survive in this situation, all you need to do is watch this video. Why are we facing a food crisis? In 2022, there were a number of food shortages, and the global food supply system was affected by a number of issues, not just the pandemic, not just the Ukrainian conflict, but other factors come into play. The possibility of future food shortages is increased by all of these issues, even if any one of them alone could be cause for alarm. Number 1. Climate change. There is little doubt that droughts, flooding, and other extreme weather conditions are becoming more frequent, and even if we may not be experiencing some of the most severe consequences of climate change, you only need to look at two of the most important farming areas in the US, the Central Valley of California and the Corn Belt in the Midwest. Farmers in California are finding it particularly hard to produce as much as they previously did due to the severe drought conditions there. We might run into difficulties if the issue isn't resolved quickly, because this area is one of our top suppliers of veggies, berries, nuts, and dairy. The reverse issue is happening in the Midwest. The priceless topsoil required to grow maize is being destroyed by rising floods and gully washers. The land contributes roughly 75% of the country's maize, and since the first European settlers arrived, it has already lost about 35% of its topsoil. As this global crisis deepens and spreads, similar issues are being faced everywhere. Furthermore, it's possible that some of the harm done won't be able to be undone right away, which might cause issues with a future worldwide food crisis. Number 2. Cyber attacks. You've surely heard about the ransomware assault that JBS, the largest meat packer in the world, suffered last year. To get everything back up and running, the corporation ultimately paid hackers $11 million, and that's far from the end of the adventure. The vulnerability of the food sector to cyber attacks is finally being accepted. The issue is that a small number of corporations provide the majority of our food supply, and many of them don't place a high priority on cybersecurity, placing the entire supply chain open to risk. Number 3. Labor shortage. One of the most significant issues economies are facing since the pandemic is labor shortage. The issue is widespread, impacting almost every link in the supply chain, including pickers, packers, transport, retail, and restaurants. Jobs with less acceptable working conditions appear to have the worst labor shortages. It's hardly surprising that the labor deficit is affecting our food supply, given that farm labor is frequently hazardous and physically taxing employment, and packing companies aren't much nicer. The truth that almost all fresh items are perishable and might degrade if they're transported too slowly is another important consideration. There aren't many drivers to transport the meat, dairy, fruits, and vegetables that are lying in boxes in a cargo container. In other instances, the food required to address the issue is literally being tossed out. Number 4. Limited packing solutions. Finally, a worry with the food sector that the majority of people are probably not even considering is that a scarcity of packaging materials is contributing to further issues. Production of materials is being hampered by the same manpower shortages that affect food production. Nowadays, supplies of basic packaging materials include paper, plastic, glass, and others are in limited supply. Without these resources, packaging facilities cannot function as intended, and goods cannot reach the shelves of supermarkets. Should you keep a food stockpile? Being ready for emergencies is obviously a smart idea, but stockpiling does not equate hoarding. Having an emergency food stockpile that contains enough non-perishable food for a few days is generally a wise choice. Be moderate in the quantity you buy and store as you increase your food supply. As we witnessed with toilet paper at the beginning of the epidemic, hoarding excessive amounts of food can lead to additional issues in the food supply chain. To guarantee you constantly have alternatives in the fridge in case of a food emergency, you might want to stock up on the following foods: nuts, rice, beans, bottled water, fruits and vegetables that can be stored, oil, baby food. How to make reasonable choices. It's critical that we all act appropriately in the face of an immense catastrophe to avoid making things worse. But in light of a worldwide food scarcity, what does that mean? Don't worry first. Then, take a look at your current food reserves. How long will the food sustain you and your family? Find out how much food your family needs to survive for 3 months, and then start planning how much food you will need to store to last for up to a year. In fact, hoarding is detrimental to everyone and is brought on by panic buying. Instead, only invest in items that your family will actually utilize. Buy 2 of everything you need each time you go to a store rather than just 1, if it's a non-perishable item. Consider the scenario when you just need 1 jar of peanut butter. Purchase 2 jars of peanut butter, but only consume 1. In the second, there's storage. Don't utilize your storage after the jar you purchased is empty. Purchase 2 more in the shop. Then proceed to consuming 1 and saving 1 once more. This enables you to gradually increase your food store without going over budget. Because of rising inflation, some of us already live within our budgets. If you employ this strategy, the cost will be reduced. Whenever you have a sufficient quantity, you should still go out and get a new jar, but only for an amount you require. When you get it home, avoid using the new one. Instead, store it and use a jar that's older and approaching its expiration date. Always choose the food that is the oldest first. Next, seek for environmentally friendly substitutes for your favorite foods and try to do as much local shopping as you can. By doing this, you may prevent issues with food transportation and the climate catastrophe. Also, make sure you have more than just food on hand for emergencies. In order to be ready, one needs a supply of food, water, clothing, shoes, medication, nutritional supplements, bidet or toilet paper, building materials, etc. Why would you require such items if there was a food shortage? People who have a scarcity mindset tend to buy in a hurry. There may be shortages in other places as well if there are food shortages. Keep in mind that during the pandemic, toilet paper was the first item to go rather than food. Before the general people believed it was in great demand, there was actually no scarcity. In reality, due to problems with the supply chain, a pandemic, and violence, many of these non-food commodities are already in limited supply. Actually, everything depends on what your priorities are. Get rid of your cable or streaming subscriptions. Sell your new car and replace it with an older model. Cut back on eating out. Stick to drinking water and no soda. Limit your driving and local travel, and thrift shop. There are ways to reduce costs in other areas of your life, so you have a little spare money for food shopping. And don't forget to look for products with less packaging. Reduce the usage of single-use plastics and explore for alternatives that are refillable or recyclable. Moving on, this might seem like a weird approach to get ready for a food scarcity, but getting ready financially is just as important. Many people believe that having food on hand in case of scarcity is more vital, therefore they purchase it using credit cards. Avoid doing that. Financial difficulties limit your alternatives and prevent you from handling other situations in your life. Mortgages could be required, but avoid consumer debt and settle any school loan debt first. Lastly, if your family and friends were not already prepped, please take the time to advise them to take action. We will all be better off if we can inspire and impart this knowledge to people around us more often.